If you could pick one word to describe, or rather predict, what 2025 will be like, what would it be? Wolfgang.
Totally unknowable. We have Donald Trump. So unknowable would be the word.
You have fulfilled your mission. Katie.
Hannah is tough. I was going to go with uncertainty, but I am going to go with brinkmanship.
In perhaps the most anticipated, or certainly most predicted event that we know will happen in 2025, just less than a month, Donald Trump will take office again in the White House. Katie, what are the first things he's planning to do?
The first thing to say is he himself has said he wants on day one, January 20th, 2025, to make a, quote, big splash. There are a lot of reports about the executive orders that are being prepared for day one. So these are measures that he can sign in the Oval Office day one and that do not need congressional approval. I think number one on his list of priorities is going to be immigration. There is a lot of talk about the prospect of declaring a national emergency. It's disputed, but he believes will give him the ability to draw in multiple agencies to, in his words, seal the border, although very unlikely to be something he can achieve with a magic wand. But I think what you're going to see on day one is this real push to at least be seen to be doing something to tackle immigration. So that's likely to be surging resources to the southern border. It's likely to be very tough announcements about people who are here without documentation. I think the real question is going to be who is around him and do they give him access to greater use of law enforcement, to potentially the use of military? Do we start to see raids? Do we start to see people being rounded up in large numbers? His top officials are talking about a spectacular approach to immigration, as many as 1 million people being deported every year. So, it really depends what that's going to look like on the ground in real life. He has indicated they will go after convicted criminals first. But within the same interview, he's also talking about, saying that it's reluctant, but that they will have to go after families, potentially including families that have American citizens within them, these mixed status families. He's saying that he doesn't want to split families up. So there's a simple solution. We will deport them all together. So I think you are likely to see, a truly inhumane approach. And I think the cruelty will be part of the point, part of the initial phase here is to scare people into leaving the country themselves or not coming. So I think, all this talk about being a dictator on day one, making a big splash, having this spectacular approach, I think that is aimed first and foremost about just really putting fear into these communities and making clear to his supporters that he intends to follow through on his campaign promises.
Wolfgang, you were nodding there when Katie said that part of the point was to make it inhumane.
Yeah, absolutely. This is very much a show of force that he will display. No, I'm completely in agreement. This is also in agreement that this is his priority because this is the one thing he can do pretty quickly. The other things that he will do, I think Katie's list point 2, 3, and 4, they might take a little longer, and these are some of these things affect us here in Europe.
Go on, quickly run us through 2, 3, and 4. That I'd
I was going to say we'll teed that up very neatly because I was going to move on to talk about tariffs. So this has been heavily trailed throughout the election campaign. The figures that Donald Trump has put on this recently is a blanket tariff of 25% on imports from United States neighbors, Mexico and Canada, which are also among its biggest trading partners, and a 10% additional tariff on imports from China. When you bear in mind that a large part of the very real anger, the pain, the discontent that has powered Trump's return to the White House was based around the cost of living, the sense that consumer prices were going up. When you go to the supermarket, prices were just too high. It was too expensive to buy things. Putting blanket tariffs on imports from your biggest trading partner is going to raise prices it is also almost certainly going to hit US companies, because the difference this time to Trump's first term is that all of these other countries have also been readying their response. We're seeing very clear indications from Mexico, from Canada, and from China that there will be retaliatory measures. So this is going to hurt US consumers, but it's also going to hurt US companies.
And how quickly can your average American consumer in their supermarket expect to see those price changes, do you reckon, in their shopping?
Well, I mean, that's a very hard calculation. There's a lot of variables. I will say it's related to point one, though, is the American economy depends very heavily, particularly in sectors like agriculture, which is very important to the price of those things that are appearing in the supermarket, depends on a foreign-born workforce. So if one of the things you're doing, in addition to tariffs, is discouraging people from coming here and deporting a lot of the people who are already here, then that's another cost pressure. So I'd say points 1 and 2 both point to, yes, very tough measures that he has trailed well in advance, but also real impacts here for the cost of living and for inflation. So it's going to be interesting to see how he navigates that. And with someone whose other number one obsession when he was last in office was the stock market. In every meeting he would have with foreign leaders, he would always talk about, look at the stock market. It's the greatest stock market we've ever seen. If we start to see an impact in markets, and if we start to see pressure from the business lobby, let's not forget some of the country's wealthiest business people are in or adjacent to his administration. It's going to be interesting to see, does he stick with that? Or does he start to shift his approach once he starts to see, the real impact and prices rising and people being very unhappy about that?
Take us through points 3 and 4, and then we will move to the impact of this remarkable man on the rest of the world.
Point 3, I will keep brief, which is retribution, the attempts to go after what he's called the enemy within. I think, again, that's going to depend who he gets in senior positions. If Kash Patel, for instance, is confirmed as the director of the FBI, I think you could see him take action quite early on to at least launch investigations, which, let's not forget, just being investigated and having to defend yourself through a court process can bankrupt individuals. So putting people who are perceived as being enemies under the microscope, requiring them to defend themselves, launching these investigations. I think you could start to see that quite early on, along with Trump has talked several times about the idea that he's going to give mass pardons for people who were convicted of rioting in the insurrection in the Capitol in January 6th. 2021. So I think you're likely to see that very, very early on. He has said, and it's not clear if he's just trying to create a better climate for confirmation hearings, but he said in a recent interview that success would be his retribution. I think slightly watering down this idea that we're going to see a lot of political show trials and political prosecutions. But when you look at some of the people who are going to be in senior positions, I think a lot of people are who would see themselves as being on that enemies list are going to be very concerned about what comes at the start of this administration. And then final point, which we can push to the second section and discuss in more detail, is Ukraine and his approach to Russia and this, again, well-trailed promise, difficult to see what happens in real life, that he is going to bring an end to that war within 24 hours.
We are going to discuss that a little bit later on. So, Wolfgang, let me bring you in here, because obviously the President of the United States, his actions, or her actions, not yet, but maybe one day, has ramifications the world over, not least in Europe. How is this next Trump presidency going to influence and shape Europe in 2025, do you think?
Oh, the Europeans are completely scared of him and not prepared for him. Let's start with the tariffs.
Yeah.
Trump has actually mentioned a lot of numbers. He mentioned 10 and 20% during the campaign. Now he's changing his numbers. On this point, we should take him seriously, but not literally. It could be any number. The way tariffs affect an economy are, economists have strong views about this, but it's ultimately hard to say, because it can be that companies just take the hit and then consumers don't get funded. This is quite possible and often happens. If he puts in a 60% tariff, say, as was originally supposed for China, or 100% tariffs, which Biden did on Chinese cars, these tariffs are obviously designed to frustrate trade. They're not really designed to raise revenue. And I think different people in his administration have different views. For example, his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, he's been talking about tariffs as a way to raise revenue for the government. Now, then you would use a lower tariff, and you can actually collect quite a bit of money. Another uncertainty is how this affects the exchange rate, because if it's done badly, it could just be compensated by a rising dollar, and then the whole effect will be completely neutralized, including for the consumer. What I think will happen for the Europeans is that if he imposes a 20% tariff, I think we'll see this. We see this already in Germany, that companies will start to upgrade their operations in the United States or in Mexico. We see Volkswagen is already planning to produce the next generation of its, sort of the last generation of its fuel-driven cars in Mexico. And that depends a little bit on how the Mexico-US relationship is going to pan out, because obviously if Trump imposes huge tariffs on Mexico, then they won't do this. But if that's sort of the old free trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, the former NAFTA, if that is sort of still maintained, and if they manage to cut a deal, and obviously immigration will be part of the deal, then that might make an awful lot of sense. But it's telling us that Volkswagen is shifting production over the American continent. And that's something we're going to accept more on, because the Germans and the EU in particular are having huge trade surpluses with America. And it's happened after, the Germans, and they had a lot of bad luck. Brexit came, and then they lost, a lot of the British market. Then Russia, they lost Russia. And now they're starting to lose China. And, the US was the last sort of bastion of big free trade they had. And, with Trump, they're in danger of losing that. So this is big. This is really an important, this is like, this will really change the way the European economy has been operating for decades. This idea of running very large trade surplus against the rest of the world they've had a wonderful run with this, but they got to change. And the thing, this is what I've been observing about Europe, they're not that good with change. So it's like they're good when things are going well, and they have stable systems, and it's very successful until it isn't. And when things sort of change rapidly, Americans are very good at sort of rapid change and adjustment. This is going to potentially prolong the recession, and I don't think that Trump cares greatly about that.
You've brought up Germany, so let's move on, because 2024 was really the year of elections. I think we had over half the world's population living in countries which headed to the polls, and we saw time and time again this so-called incumbency curse. The trend looks likely to continue in 2025, not least in Germany, which head to the polls in February, Wolfgang. And I know you've written about this for the New Statesman lots of times. You've got the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, the Germany's far-right party. It's been making significant gains. Do you think they could win?
No. I think it's possible that they might win in 29 under certain circumstances. But no, I'm not saying they're not going to win because the polls, put them only at 18%, and the leading party, the CDU, is at between 30 and 36% in this range. German polls are shifting, and polls have been mostly wrong actually in the last. They've been done, including in the UK, they've actually been quite bad. They got the result right, but the actual numbers were totally wrong. The French polls were bad. The American polls were obviously off. So you've seen this. So I'm not believing this. But the AfD, I think it's about 18 to 20%. If they were to win, it would be a major disaster for the EU, for Ukraine, for a lot of things we do. But that is not going to happen. There is in all likelihood. And, it's hard to predict elections, but this is the most certain prediction I can make, is that Friedrich Merz will end up as the leader of the next government. So Olaf Scholz is history. The question is, and the interesting question is not whether Merz is going to win. This is sort of a country where the interesting question is not who's going to win the election. This is a country where the interesting question is of what kind of government is he going to form. And he could form a government because he's not going to have a majority. And he will have essentially two types of choices: to go with the Social Democrats. This is the party of Olaf Scholz. It's a party that's skeptical about Ukraine. This is a party of the German welfare state. That's for the CDU a real problem, because the CDU really wants to reform the welfare state and wants to loosen up things. So this is going to be a difficult thing. The alternative is for the CDU to go into coalition with the Greens. Now, the Greens are closer to the CDU on foreign policy. The Greens are actually been very different from the Greens like 20 years ago. The Greens today, for weapons deliveries, they are some of the hawkish in military, in foreign policy terms and security policy terms. They're actually one of the most hawkish party in Germany, and they are the strongest supporter of Ukraine. So the Greens are closer to the CDU on foreign policy, and I think Merz cares more about foreign policy. So I would think my instinct would say that if it works arithmetically for him, and that's always you add numbers together and say, is it a majority or not? He would be inclined to go with the Greens. The CSU, the Bavarian party, doesn't like the Greens because they're mostly focused on economic policy. The Greens have been responsible for the nuclear power station phase out. They've been responsible for a lot of laws and bureaucracy. We have laws that have proved a huge burden on companies. So there are two different perspectives on which the center right in Germany is split. Now, to come back to the AfD question is, if they don't fix the German economy, and the German economy has been badly performing for a long time now. If they don't fix the German economy and the discontent in the country goes further, and we see VW, Volkswagen's closing factories, and all the car companies are shedding jobs, and the supplier companies are going bust. The nature of the economy is shifting. There's no longer that kind of economy that everybody had known. That could, and if they do commit other errors, there is a scenario in which the AfD could become the largest party. That doesn't mean they will form the government, because there's a coalition situation. So who would go into coalition with them? And is it still possible to form a government against them? At the moment, that's the strategy. They don't want to have them. They have these, what they call a firewall. They have firewalls against the AfD. They keep them out of government. But it means that the centrist parties always form coalitions amongst each other. You see something similar happening right now in France, where we've had Macron appointing Michel Barnier as a prime minister and having been supported by a group of mostly centrist parties.
Do you see a return to stability in France in 2025?
I don't, because there are a number of conflicting objectives at play. There is a possibility that they hold another elections, but the fundamental issue is not so much French politics, but the French electorate. France is a country that is split, and unlike the United States, they're split in a similar way. But unlike the United States, it doesn't produce these majorities, except for the president, because the French voting system produces very fragmented political parties. The right is very strong, and the other problem that the French all need to do, which this is the reason why I actually think it's not going to happen, is because they have to actually impose austerity. The EU demands it. And there isn't a majority anywhere in the French political spectrum in favor of austerity.
Katie, Wolfgang painting a picture of a pretty unstable and rather worrying Europe there. Just take us back to North America for a moment, because we've got elections in Germany, as Wolfgang's just been talking about, also elections in Canada, where it's widely anticipated that Justin Trudeau, having been in power for coming up for a decade, will be voted out. How bad are things for his Liberal Party?
I think there are real parallels with what Wolfgang has just been describing in Europe and with what I was describing here earlier in the United States. And I think that's going to be exacerbated for Justin Trudeau by the fact that he has been in power there for so long. If it feels like he has been Prime Minister of Canada for most of your adult life, you would be forgiven for thinking that. He was elected in 2015, really burst onto the scene as this very charismatic, energetic, young by prime ministerial standards at 43 years old, really asserted Canada's place, was always a major part of these big international summits. But that sheen has really worn off. I think he has made a fairly unsuccessful bet on immigration. So one of his major positions was that Canada needs a foreign-born workforce. Canada needs people to come in. That's going to be what drives the economy. That's going to be what makes Canada more successful. But what that has seen is also then house prices absolutely skyrocketing. Some of the same issues with cost of living, with pressure on social services. And I think there's been a real shift in public opinion in recent years away from that, and a sense that, in Canada too, this has gone too far, that there are too many people are coming into the country, and tougher measures are needed. Trudeau is also personally, like I say, he was this very charismatic figure when he first came to power. There have been a succession of scandals since then. I think in the 2019 election, photos of him wearing blackface and brownface as a younger person came to light. He was implicated in a conflict of interest scandal. And then I think there is just this same anti-incumbency failing that has kicked incumbent prime ministers out of power, as we've seen the world over. And there's no reason to think that that is going to break next year. There are calls from within his own party for him to step down to give the Liberal Party a chance in the elections, which we don't know for sure when this will be. I think it legally has to be by October of 2025, but it could be sooner. If the opposition is able to trigger a vote of no confidence. And, so far he has given no indication that he plans to step aside, but certainly I think, within his own party now, there are calls for him to do that.
We saw in the US election a sort of a bit of a pushback, or arguably a pushback against so-called sort of progressive identity politics. I wonder, can you see that in Canada at all? Because obviously the Liberal Party if you think the Democrats were into their identity politics, the Liberals are on steroids.
I think he lost some of his own credibility with progressives just through some of his own personal scandals, as I outlined. And I think, again, as where Wolfgang is in Europe, I think for a lot of people, this comes down to, do people feel better off than they were? Do they feel the country is on the right track? Do they feel things are getting better? Do they feel the economy is getting stronger? And I think the problem for Justin Trudeau is that right now, the answer to most of those questions is no. His personal approval rating is down at 28%, compared to, I think, 65% or so when he came in. And when you look at the figure, it really trails off, particularly from the time of the COVID restrictions. And it's been a fairly steady descent since then. So it's really hard to see how he turns that around. I will say we've seen him pretty active in recent days in response to these threats of tariffs from the US. He flew down to Mar-a-Lago to meet with Donald Trump. Perhaps he is going to attempt to position himself as Canada's great defender against this bullying new president to the south, and that did help him. The perception that he was standing up to Donald Trump did help him during Donald Trump's first term. But I think, it's very unclear if that is going to work, not least because Trump himself has responded to those efforts by really belittling Trudeau, calling him the governor and joking, we think, that Canada is a state, could become the 51st state of the United States. Hopefully that is a joke.